What truly sets apart Pope Benedict XVI from Pope Francis? It's not just about different personalities, but about two deeply contrasting views on tradition, liturgy, and the future of the Church. In this video, we'll examine 5 key differences that are shaping modern Catholicism and that every believer should know. Understanding these distinctions is essential to grasp what's happening at the heart of the Church. Let's begin with the first. 1. The perspective on the liturgy. The liturgy is the central axis of the Church's life, but the two popes have interpreted its meaning and function in profoundly different ways. Pope Benedict XVI saw in the liturgy a link between the Church today and its centuries-old tradition. With the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum of 2007, he reaffirmed that the Tridentine Rite, also known as the Latin Mass, had never been abolished, allowing priests to freely celebrate it. This gesture was not only a recognition of the faithful attached to the pre-conciliar liturgy, but also an affirmation of the value of tradition as a shared heritage. According to Benedict, the traditional liturgy, with its beauty and rigor, reflected the centrality of God and the mystery of the Eucharist. In his writings and speeches, he insisted that the liturgy is not a mere performance or a modifiable event, but a sacred act that must be preserved in its authenticity. His goal was a reform in continuity, that is, a respectful updating of traditions without breaking with the past. With Pope Francis, however, the perspective has changed significantly. In 2021, with the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, he introduced strong restrictions on the celebration of the Tridentine Mass, declaring that the Novus Ordo, that is, the rite reformed after the Second Vatican Council, is the sole expression of the Roman Rite. This decision was motivated by the need to promote unity in the Church, but it has drawn considerable criticism. For Francis, the liturgy seems to be a pastoral instrument to bring people closer to faith, rather than an immutable act. This vision has led to celebrations of a more informal nature, often integrated with local cultural elements. During the Synod for the Amazon, for example, some celebrations incorporated indigenous symbols and rites, generating accusations of syncretism. Many faithful attached to tradition have perceived Traditionis Custodes as an attack on the richness of the Church's liturgy, lamenting that the Novus Ordo is less solemn and less oriented towards the mystery of the sacred. Benedict XVI had warned of the danger of an impoverished worship, which risks becoming a celebration centered on man rather than on God, a fear that many associate with the liturgical innovations promoted by Francis. In conclusion, while Benedict XVI worked to safeguard the liturgy as an immutable treasure of faith, Pope Francis has prioritized a pastoral approach, even at the cost of creating tensions among the faithful. This divergence reveals two opposing views of the role of tradition in the life of the Church. 2. The vision of the Church. The difference in vision regarding what the Church should represent in the contemporary world is one of the most profound contrasts between Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. Both have faced the challenge of guiding the Church in an era of growing secularization, but with very different perspectives and strategies. For Pope Benedict XVI, the Church must be a creative minority in a world increasingly distant from Christian values. This vision is based on the conviction that the quality of faith is more important than the number of faithful. Benedict believed that the Church should not seek compromises with the world, but should remain a bulwark of unchanging truth, even if that meant losing popularity or social influence. In his reflections, he often denounced the dictatorship of relativism, stating that the Church cannot bend to cultural fads or the ethical shifts of the moment. He insisted on a deep faith rooted in tradition, promoting catechesis that would form aware Christians capable of bearing witness to Christ in an often hostile context. Pope Francis, on the other hand, has proposed an outgoing Church, oriented towards encountering people in their fragilities and on the existential peripheries. For him, the priority is not the preservation of tradition, but pastoral dialogue with the other, even when this requires doctrinal and liturgical flexibility. This approach is reflected in initiatives such as the Synod on the Family and the encyclical Amoris Laetitia, which have introduced greater openness on controversial issues, such as access to the sacraments for divorced and remarried individuals. While these decisions have been praised for their inclusive intent, they have also drawn criticism, as some see them as a weakening of the Church's traditional teachings. Supporters of Benedict XVI appreciate his vision of a church faithful to itself, one that does not renounce its own identity to please the world. On the other hand, Francis's approach is perceived by many as an attempt to make the Church more accessible, sometimes at the expense of doctrinal coherence and fidelity to tradition. In essence, this contrast reflects two different conceptions of the relationship between the Church and the modern world. Benedict opted for a counter-cultural witness, emphasizing the firmness of principles, while Francis favors an inclusivity that risks blurring the lines between tradition and cultural adaptation. The debate over these two visions remains central to the future of the Church and its ability to face the challenges of our time. 3. The management of tradition. The relationship with tradition, understood as the valuable heritage of faith, liturgy, and doctrine transmitted over the centuries, represents one of the most significant points of divergence between Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. Their opposing views reflect two different ways of interpreting the role of the Church in preserving and transmitting its identity. For Pope Benedict XVI, tradition is the foundation on which the Church stands. He sees it as a living and dynamic reality, capable of dialoguing with the demands of the present without ever renouncing its roots. This perspective is embodied in his idea of reform in continuity, a principle according to which necessary reforms must be harmoniously integrated with the received heritage, without creating ruptures. A central aspect of his pontificate was the defense of the correct interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. Benedict rejected readings that saw in the Council a break with the past, emphasizing instead continuity with tradition. Through the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum, he reaffirmed that the Tridentine Rite and the Reformed Rite can coexist as complementary expressions of the liturgy, highlighting the value of a church that safeguards its past to illuminate the future. Pope Francis, on the other hand, interprets tradition as a process in continuous evolution, oriented towards responding to the pastoral challenges of the present time. For him, tradition is not a static block, but a heritage that is renewed to meet the needs of the people. This vision is reflected in his pastoral approach, where adaptation and flexibility often take precedence over doctrine. An emblematic example is the encyclical Amoris Laetitia, which introduced greater openness on sensitive issues, such as access to the sacraments for divorced and remarried individuals. This stance has sparked much debate. On the one hand, it has been appreciated for its attention to concrete pastoral situations. On the other hand, it has been criticized for the risk of compromising the coherence and universality of the Church's teachings. While Benedict XVI sought to safeguard tradition as an immutable pillar and a beacon of eternal truths, Francis promotes a more dynamic vision, often perceived as a break with the past. Supporters of Benedict find in his pontificate a point of reference for a stable and coherent church, rooted in tradition. Conversely, Francis's approach is appreciated by those seeking a more open church, closer to the reality of people's lives, but is viewed with skepticism by those who fear a loss of identity. This divergence on the meaning and role of tradition is not just a theological question, but touches the heart of the Church's future. The way in which the Church manages to balance fidelity to tradition and the capacity for renewal will be decisive in facing the challenges of the modern world and remaining a spiritual point of reference for the faithful. 4. The relationship with traditionalist movements. The relationship with traditionalist movements, often associated with the Tridentine Mass and a rigorous view of doctrine, is another element of profound difference between the pontificates of Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. Their divergent policies have significantly impacted the Church's dialogue with these communities attached to tradition. Pope Benedict XVI made reconciliation with traditionalist movements a priority. Among the most significant gestures was the Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum, which reiterated that the Tridentine Rite had never been abolished, allowing it to be celebrated with greater freedom. This document represented a sign of openness towards the faithful attached to this liturgical form and an attempt to heal the divisions that arose after the Second Vatican Council. Another important gesture was the lifting of the excommunication of the bishops of the Society of St. Pius VI, an act that reflected Benedict's desire to bring these groups closer to the Church again without renouncing doctrinal firmness. For Benedict, dialogue with traditionalists was a way to build bridges, valuing their fidelity to tradition as an asset to the entire ecclesial community. Pope Francis, on the other hand, has adopted a more critical and restrictive approach towards traditionalist movements. In the Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes, Francis limited the use of the Tridentine Rite, reaffirming that the Novus Ordo is the sole expression of the Roman liturgy. He also imposed restrictions on the autonomy of priests to celebrate according to the old rite, delegating to bishops the task of regulating these celebrations. Francis justified these measures by arguing that some traditionalist movements, instead of promoting unity, risk fueling divisions within the Church and rejecting the Second Vatican Council. However, for many faithful attached to tradition, these restrictions have been perceived as an exclusion and a rejection of the value of their spiritual heritage. While supporters of Benedict XVI see his policy of dialogue as a model of balance and respect, Francis's approach has been considered by some as a divisive gesture. His criticisms of the rigidity of traditionalists and the limitations on the Tridentine Mass have heightened tensions and contributed to further polarizing the ecclesial community. This divergence reflects two opposing views on how the Church should relate to traditionalist movements. Benedict sought to heal the wounds of the past and welcome these communities as an integral part of the ecclesial body, promoting a unity that did not compromise fidelity to principles. Francis, on the other hand, opted for a more decisive and critical approach, considered necessary to preserve unity around the reforms of the Council, but which many believe has further exacerbated divisions. This contrast is emblematic of the challenges the Church faces in managing the relationship with tradition and the different liturgical and doctrinal sensibilities within it. The way in which the Church manages to navigate these tensions will be crucial for its future and for maintaining its ability to welcome all souls without renouncing its own identity. And finally, number 5, communication and symbolism. The communication style and personal symbolism of Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis highlight another profound difference between the two pontificates. Although they do not directly address doctrinal issues, these aspects have had a strong impact on the perception of their leadership, both within and outside the Church. Pope Benedict XVI, faithful to his academic background, adopted a theologically precise and intellectually rigorous language. His homilies, encyclicals, and speeches were often filled with philosophical and theological references, addressed to an audience seeking a deeper understanding of Catholic truths. This style, while appreciated by the more educated faithful, could seem distant to those unfamiliar with theological language. Benedict's symbolism reflected his attention to continuity with tradition. Elements such as the camauero, the ornate capes, and the iconic red shoes represented not only a link with the popes of the past, but also respect for the solemnity and dignity of the papacy as a divine institution. For Benedict, the Pope was above all a custodian of the Church's millennial tradition. Pope Francis, on the other hand, has revolutionized both the language and symbolism of the papacy. His communication style is simple, direct, and accessible, often rich in imagery and metaphors from everyday life. This approach has allowed him to reach a much wider audience, even outside the Catholic world, earning him great popularity. However, the simplicity of his language has sometimes been criticized for its lack of clarity on complex, theological, and moral issues. His personal symbolism also emphasizes a humble lifestyle close to the people. The rejection of the red cape, the choice to wear simpler vestments and residing in the Casa Santa Marta instead of the Apostolic Palace are gestures that embody the image of a shepherd pope among the people. However, these decisions have raised concerns among traditionalists who fear a trivialization of the papal role and a departure from the sacred and historical bond of the papacy. While Benedict XVI has often been perceived as the guardian of tradition and the Church's theological identity, Francis has sought to present himself as a pontiff oriented towards the present, in dialogue with the world and its fragilities. This contrast is also reflected in the perception that the faithful have of them. On the one hand, Benedict is seen as a figure of intellectual and spiritual firmness. On the other hand, Francis is appreciated for his closeness, simplicity, and ability to communicate with everyone. The debate about the language and symbolism of the papacy is not just a matter of aesthetics or formality, but touches the heart of how the Church presents itself to the contemporary world. While Benedict embodied a vision of safeguarding tradition, Francis chose to emphasize the human and pastoral aspect of the papacy. These differences continue to influence the debate within the Church. Which of the two styles do you think best represents the role of the Pope in a time of great change? Let us know in the comments below, and if you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. God bless you.